Hello, this is Mr. Unrefriesen, and we're going to talk today about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1963, Americans were witnessing nonviolent protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, being violently suppressed by the city's government. There was increasing pressure on the federal government to guarantee all Americans their civil rights. Birmingham was a city so violent that it was often called Bombingham. In 1963, in the middle of the debate over the Civil Rights Act, 4 young girls on their way to Sunday school were killed when a church was bombed by segregationists. 1963 was the year that MLK wrote his manifesto detailing his philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience. It's absolutely amazing, and you should read it. Google A Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and you won't be disappointed. It's something that you should absolutely read. These actions, among many others, persuaded JFK to call on Congress to create legislation to fulfill the promise of the 14th Amendment. No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Kennedy did not live to see the bill become law. After his assassination, President Johnson used all methods of persuasion to get the bill passed. He said to Congress, "No memorial oration or eulogy would more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought for so long." You know that famous "I'm Just a Bill" song, right? Well, it makes it seem like it's very easy, actually, for a bill to become a law. But one of the things that this bill shows us is even when you have a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, it's tough for a bill to become a law. Here's some examples. The chair of the House Rules Committee, a Democrat and also a Virginia segregationist, refused to allow the bill to clear his committee until under threat of a discharge petition that would automatically remove it from Rules Committee to the floor of the House. And in the Senate, in a very similar thing, the Senate Majority Leader, a Democrat, had to get creative with the Senate's rules to bypass the committee of a Southern segregationist that was chaired also by a Democrat. There was a Southern bloc of 18 senators who filibustered. Remember, this means talking to stop all legislation from coming out of the Senate, for a total of 57 days to prevent the bill from passing. The Senate, as compromise in the legislature often requires, had to offer a watered-down bill to gain enough votes to invoke cloture, which is 60 votes that are necessary to kill a filibuster. And then once the Senate passed it, remember it's a different version than the House had passed, so then the bill had to go to a conference committee, and the House then had to agree to the Senate's version before it could even go to President Johnson's desk, who immediately signed the bill. Below here are the statistics for who voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by a political party. And in the past, I've had students who scratch their heads at this a little bit, because when you look, you can see that the party that was the most in favor of this bill was the Republican Party. They voted for the bill 80% to 20%, whereas the Democrats seemed to be the ones that were against the bill. If you remember, the segregationists who were in charge of committees that did not want to allow the bill through were all Democrats. And that's one of the reasons that even though it was Democratic President, Democratic House, Democratic Senate, this bill didn't become law very easily. And this shows us that the times were changing in the South. And although the South had for a long, long time been Democratic, that was going to start to shift. If you look at the Senate, we see pretty similar percentages of support, where the Republicans supported the bill 82% of the time, Democrats supported the bill 69% of the time. Maybe a more effective way of looking at voting for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was to look at North versus South rather than Democratic versus Republican. So, for example, when you look and see the Northerners, Democrats and Republicans both supported the bill very strongly, 84% and 98% for the Northern Democrats. And so this kind of shows what President Kennedy and President Johnson were starting to do for the Democrat Party. They came out as the party of desegregation, of civil rights legislation. And you can see Northern Democrats were very much for this. Southern Democrats, 95% against. They were the ones who led the filibuster against the Civil Rights Act. The bill becomes law. And we can look at a couple codes here on the top of the bill. First of all, up in the corner, we can see here that it was House of Representatives Bill 7152, the 7152nd bill introduced into the House during the 88th Congress, and it was the 352nd bill passed during the 88th Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the very first ever civil rights bill to actually overcome a Senate filibuster. And so it is a very significant piece of legislation. What are the major parts of this bill? Let's take a look at a couple. Very importantly, racial discrimination became illegal in hotels, motels, restaurants, and other places of public accommodation. This was to try to put an end to the Jim Crow legislation and the Jim Crow laws that were still in existence, often in the South, but they occurred all over the country. It forbade discrimination in employment on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, or gender. The gender piece was an interesting bit that was added. Some people hypothesize actually that the gender piece was added to get people to vote against the bill, but the gender and the actually expanded some of the scope of the bill that wasn't originally intended. It also created the EEOC, which stands for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a government watchdog agency that looks over discrimination in employment. And so hopefully to give some sort of teeth and some watchdog potential to this law. The next piece gives us an opportunity to review an important concept from pretty early on in class. The act allowed the government to withhold federal grants from state and local governments that did practice segregation. So if you remember early on, there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the government the power to raise the drinking age to 21. That's a state-level decision. But if the states didn't raise their drinking age to 21, then they lost highway transportation dollars. And so they basically decided to raise the drinking age to get the money. Very similar concept here. If you want federal money for your state and local government projects, you got to comply. You segregate, you lose money. So there's a punishment. There's an enforcement mechanism built in. Some of the other things it did is it strengthened voter rights legislation, and it authorized the Justice Department to initiate lawsuits to deseg public schools and facilities that weren't complying with the law. One of the sad things is we're 10 years after Brown v. Board. 1954 was the Brown v. Board decision. Now it's 1964. 1 decade after that Supreme Court decision, and only 1% of Southern schools had desegregated. So this allowed the Department of Justice to actually bring lawsuits to make it happen more quickly. Here's a famous picture from the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. President LBJ is handing to MLK one of the pens used to sign this historic piece of legislation. But all legislation comes with a price, and maybe there's a political price to be paid. And LBJ, being a very politically savvy man, was alleged to have said to his aide at the time, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republicans for a long time to come." Here's some proof that LBJ might have been correct. What you have here is a map from the 1960 presidential election. And you see here the votes between Kennedy, Nixon, and Byrd. And we have a third-party candidate, apparently. Now, his electoral votes, he got 1 here in Oklahoma, 8 in Mississippi, 6 in Alabama. Now, Byrd was a segregationist politician from the state of Virginia. And the South has traditionally voted Democratic. And here you see kind of the traditional band of the South voting very, very blue. And so those states did vote Democratic, but not for this northern Massachusetts new Democrat civil rights supporter kind of Democrat, but for kind of like the old school segregationist Civil War era Democrat. And you see here, though, that the South still is very, very Democratic. Look what happens when we flash forward. If we go to the 2000 presidential election, look at this same area across the traditional Deep South. So the Solid South used to mean that the South was solidly Democratic, and now we see that the South has become reliably Republican, especially in this 2000 election map. One last thing that we should talk about, and a very important part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is how it took advantage of the Commerce Clause, that extremely versatile clause in the Constitution that allows Congress to regulate anything to do with interstate commerce. If you remember the story from class, I told a story about a black family that was driving through Atlanta and wanted to stay at this hotel. And who wouldn't? I mean, look at this. The Heart of Atlanta Resort Motel. Would you not love to stay at any place that had a diving board that awesome, right? So this is a fantastic resort experience. However, the family was not allowed to stay because of Jim Crow racist laws that said whites only could stay at the Heart of Atlanta Motel. Well, once the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, the government had the ability to go and deseg those places. And this case was one of the first tests to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what they did decide was Congress could use the Interstate Commerce Clause to force private businesses, not just public spaces, not just like city bus stops and places like that, or courtrooms or restaurants, but private businesses to abide by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And you might remember now that there are people that think that the Commerce Clause is being stretched too far, like, for example, Justice Roberts and the right wing of the court shooting down Obamacare being based on the Commerce Clause, or the Violence Against Women Act being shot down because it stretched the Commerce Clause too far, or the Gun-Free School Zones Act being shot down because it stretched the Commerce Clause too far. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and most of its oomph, most of its power comes from the fact that Congress has the ability to regulate interstate commerce. So that's a little bit about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, an amazing story about a very powerful law as part of our civil rights in this country. Thanks for listening.